It's well known among all of us that mankind is capable of some truly awful things. But still, no matter how much we hear about or read about these atrocities, it never gets any easier. The notion that some humans are capable of such brutal, needless violence is something that's difficult for many of us to understand. But from centuries-old cold cases to the darkest of horrors carried out in the name of war, in this video we'll be looking at 5 real locations on this planet with hauntingly dark backstories, many of which can be visited to this day. As always, it's time to hit those lights, sit back, and enjoy. Gibraltar Point Lighthouse, Canada. The Gibraltar Point Lighthouse is located on Toronto Island, an island located in Lake Ontario in Canada. Although it was authorised in 1803, it wasn't until 1808 that construction began, and the lighthouse was completed 1 year later in 1809. It's the oldest existing lighthouse on the Great Lakes, and one of Toronto's oldest buildings. But age aside, most notably, the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse is best known for the death of its very first keeper, whose murder forms the basis of Toronto's most famous ghost story, and is something out of a murder mystery story, complete with an unsolved murder and many paranormal sightings. It all begins with German-born John Rudermuller, the first keeper of the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse, who was found murdered in 1815. According to the local legend, soldiers from Fort York paid the keeper a visit on the evening of January 2nd in search of his bootlegged beer. But the occasion was not the merry one that you might expect. Instead, the soldiers, who had had too much to drink at this point, got into an argument with John, which resulted in his murder. The story goes that the soldiers attempted to conceal the crime by dismembering the keeper's body and hiding the remains in various locations. Fast forward 80 years to 1893, and another keeper named George Durham, who was familiar with the story, decided to look for evidence of John's murder. More specifically, he wanted to find his body. Upon searching for it, he stumbled across a part of a jawbone and pieces of a coffin just outside the lighthouse walls. Unfortunately, it was impossible to connect these items with John, given the lack of forensic techniques at the time. This was the late 1800s, don't forget. In another version of the story, the soldiers thought that John was trying to rip them off because they saw the beer freeze one cold night and assumed the alcohol content was low enough for the beer to freeze. A more recent exploration of the case uncovered that John was a real man. He had been born in 1763 in Ansbach, Germany, where he worked as a royal servant for 20 years in the households of the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Kent. He became the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse keeper in 1809. It was also found that indeed John had suffered a violent death on January 2nd, 1815, being just 52 years old at the time. 2 soldiers were charged with his murder, but were ultimately acquitted. The soldiers were Irishmen of the Glengarry Light Infantry named John Henry and John Blumen. Modern evidence suggests that the keeper's body was not mutilated, but it's unclear if his body was ever recovered. Nanjing, China. The city of Nanjing in China is the site of one of the most gruesome and bloody invasions from the Second Sino-Japanese War. Those familiar with World War II will be all too familiar with this horrific event, but for those who do not, viewer discretion is advised. For a period of 6 weeks, starting on December 13th of 1937, mass murder and rape was carried out by Imperial Japanese troops against the residents of Nanjing, which was then the capital of China during a war between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan. That December 13th, Japan captured Nanjing and subjected its residents to true horror. At one time before the war, Nanjing was once one of China's most prosperous cities and industrial centres. In the aftermath of what is now known as the Nanjing Massacre, or the Nanking Massacre, it was abandoned as the country's capital and took decades to recover from the atrocities, many of which we cannot speak of in a video. Following their victory in Shanghai in 1937, Japanese troops turned their attention to Nanjing. Chinese troops were ordered to leave the city by the government, leaving it defended only by untrained and inexperienced auxiliary troops. The citizens were forbidden from leaving the city, although some did so anyway. Unfortunately, many stayed behind. A safety zone was created by Western businessmen and missionaries in November that year, which was the size equivalent of New York's Central Park. Then, a month later, in December, the Chinese government abandoned Nanjing. The remaining citizens who hadn't fled were ordered into the safety zone. As Japanese soldiers made their way to Nanjing, there were countless whispers about the atrocities committed by the troops, including stories that they held killing contests. Neither children nor the elderly were exempt from the cruelty of the Japanese military, and upon entering Nanjing, they looted and burned 1/3 of the buildings. Entire families were massacred, and thousands were left dead in mass graves. Oil was thrown onto the bodies before they were set alight, and they reportedly went door to door in search of victims. Beheadings and firing squad deaths were extremely popular methods of execution among the Japanese troops. Although Japan initially agreed that they would respect the safety zone, in January of 1938 they dismantled the zone completely. The massacre of Nanjing citizens carried on until the first week of February. Historians are unable to determine the death toll, as most Japanese military records on the killings were kept secret or were destroyed after the surrender at the end of World War II. Regardless, it's believed that between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians were murdered, and between 20,000 and 80,000 girls and women were sexually assaulted. Lancaster Castle, England. Lancaster Castle, also known as John o' Gaunt's Castle, is the oldest standing building in Lancaster, England. As a result, it has a very colourful history. Early history on the castle is unclear, but it's generally agreed that the castle was founded around the 11th century, where it was mostly used as a prison. After the 1800s, executions at the castle began to take place at the Hanging Corner, an area in between the tower and the wall on the east side of the terrace steps. Today, the ground floor of the tower is on the drop room, which contains relics from the executions. Out of the 200 hangings which occurred at the castle, only 43 of them were for murder. Other hanging offences at the time included burglary, passing forged notes, and cattle stealing. Most of the people who were executed at Lancaster Castle were found guilty of one of these more minor offences. 131 of these hangings were carried out by one hangman named Ned Barlow. The last public execution was on March 25th of 1865, when Stephen Burke was hanged for the murder of his wife. The case of the Pendle Witches is probably one of the most famous in Lancaster Castle's history. The Pendle Witches, which consisted of two families headed by widowed elderly women, lived during the reigns of Elizabeth I and James I, so around 1558 to 1625. As we explored in our History of Witches and Witchcraft documentary, the era of James I was an unpleasant one for anyone who either was a witch or was accused of witchcraft. When he came into power, he brought with him a disdain for the craft and changes in the law which made it so that various forms of witchcraft practice could be punished by death. 3 generations of one family were accused of witchcraft, and so the Pendle Witches stood trial at Lancaster Castle. Elizabeth Southern, the elderly widow of one of the 2 families, died in prison while awaiting trial, She was 80 years old. The trial occurred in August of 1612, and the prisoners were not allowed to have a defence counsel, nor could they call any witnesses to speak on their behalf. In addition to the 10 family members, the 7 members of the so-called Samlesbury witches were also tried, along with 2 other women. The witnesses for the prosecution gave shaky and inconsistent evidence against the Pendle witches. Their information was largely based on rumours, idle gossip, and false confessions. Oddly enough, the prosecution's chief witness was the granddaughter of Elizabeth Southern. After just 3 days, 10 family members were found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to death. Security Prison 21 in Cambodia. A former secondary school in Phnom Penh was the site of torture, murder, and unbridled cruelty in the mid to late 1970s, when the Khmer Rouge regime was in power in Cambodia. In 1976, the regime established the state of Democratic Kampuchea. The party's aim was to establish a classless, communist state and reject the free market and capitalism. Between 1976 and 1979, 20,000 people were imprisoned at a former secondary school, which was used as Security Prison 21 by the regime. It was just one of around 150 and 196 torture and execution centres established by the regime. The true number of prisoners is unknown, and it's estimated that 12,000 people were killed in the prison. Iron bars and barbed wire were placed across the building's windows to prevent both escapes and suicides. Classrooms were converted into tiny prison and torture chambers, and electrified barbed wire was set up to surround the building. At any one time, 1,000 to 1,500 prisoners were held in the building, where they were repeatedly tortured and coerced into naming family members and associates, who in turn were arrested, tortured, and killed. Most prisoners were held for between 2 and 3 months. Upon arriving at the jail, prisoners were photographed and required to give a detailed autobiography. They were then forced to strip down to their underwear, and their possessions were confiscated. Often they were shackled to floors or walls, or in large mass cells, where they would be shackled to long pieces of iron bar. They slept on the floor without mats, mosquito nets, or blankets, and were forbidden to speak to one another. The prisoners' day started at around 4:30 a.m. with strip searches. They were fed 4 spoonfuls of porridge and a watery soup of leaves twice a day. Drinking water or doing anything without the permission of the guards resulted in serious beatings. Victims were also sometimes forced to eat human waste and drink urine. These unhygienic conditions in which the prisoners lived led to a whole host of health conditions, including ringworm and rashes. Medical staff at the jail were untrained and offered treatment only to sustain prisoners' lives after being injured during interrogation. But when it comes to the torture methods, it was pretty brutal. Electric shocks, heated tools, waterboarding, and the pulling out of fingernails were all used as methods of torture in the prison. Sexual abuse also occurred, despite the fact that it was against the regime's policy. It's long been believed that the vast majority of victims were innocent. The confessions given by prisoners often included fabricated stories about their involvement in espionage activities for the likes of the CIA, KGB, which never amounted to anything. By 1976, just 1 year after the prison's opening, there was no more space to bury bodies. As a result, prisoners were taken to Crow's Feet Pond, where they were killed by teenagers and buried in graves that held as few as 6 bodies and as many as 100. This area came to be known as one of many killing fields. Harbin, China. The name Unit 731 probably doesn't mean much to any of you watching, unless you're very familiar with military history, but it was in fact the home of much cruelty and depravity between 1937 and 1945. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, which was set up in the Pingfang district of the city of Harbin, in northeast of China. Officially, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwangtung Army and was set up in 1937. 3,000 workers at the unit were led by Lieutenant General Shiroishi. Unit 731 used thousands of Chinese civilians and wartime prisoners as guinea pigs to breed and develop killer diseases. This place is the stuff of nightmares. Human subjects were infected with the plague and anthrax, before being vivisected without anesthesia to see how these diseases affected the body. Victims were also tied to stakes so that biological weapons like bombs filled with plague-infested fleas could be tested, and limbs were removed and reattached to different areas of the body. The same thing also occurred with organs. But the atrocities did not stop there, not by a long shot. Weapons such as flamethrowers were tested on humans. Some victims were deprived of food and water to determine the length of time until death. Others were placed into low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their sockets. Some were even injected with animal blood and seawater. Sexual acts were forced between prisoners, usually between a victim who was infected with an STI and one who was not, to study how the diseases were transmitted. At least 11 Chinese cities were attacked with biological agents, one of which was an attack on Changde in 1941, which led to 10,000 biological casualties and 1,700 deaths among unprepared Japanese soldiers. Before Japan's surrender at the end of World War II, the experiment sites were destroyed along with any evidence, and the remaining 400 prisoners were shot. Mice left over from experiments which were infected with the bubonic plague were released. It's believed that this move resulted in the deaths of thousands of civilians, but has been impossible to track. For 40 years, Unit 731's activities were a closely guarded secret of World War II. It wasn't until the 1990s that Japanese officials acknowledged the unit's existence, but even then, they did not disclose details. Those emerged only as a result of testimony from former members, photographs, and documentary evidence. Only a handful of those involved in the unit were prosecuted for war crimes in China, while none were prosecuted in Japan. At the end of World War II, America granted members of the unit with immunity in exchange for details of their experiments. Lieutenant General Ishii lived on the outskirts of Tokyo until he died in 1959. Many leaders of the experiments gained high-ranking positions in medical schools and health research centers. And in recent years, the National Archives of Japan disclosed the names of 3,600 members of the unit in an attempt to encourage historians to continue their research into the unit and all of its atrocities. We have a Unit 731 in-depth documentary ready to record, and we'll be publishing it on Patreon soon. For more information, check out our Patreon page in the description below or in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next video.